When my husband of 15 years threw me out of our Chicago penthouse for his pregnant 25-year-old secretary, she thought she'd won the ultimate prize. She moved into what she believed was his luxury apartment, started driving what she thought were his expensive cars, and began planning a lavish wedding with what she assumed was his money. But when she discovered the truth about who I really was and what I'd been hiding for our entire marriage, her perfect new life crumbled in ways she never saw coming. Hi, I'm Rachel Chen, and this is the story of how my cheating husband and his mistress learned the most expensive lesson of their lives. If you've ever wondered what happens when someone mistakes kindness for weakness, or when a gold digger discovers she picked the wrong target, then you need to hear what happened next. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even. It's simply letting people face the consequences of their own assumptions. Let me tell you about the double life I've been living for 15 years. My name is Rachel Chen. I'm 45 years old, and I'm the founder and CEO of Chen Consulting Group, one of the most successful business consulting firms in the Midwest. My company has offices in Chicago, Denver, and Atlanta, with clients ranging from Fortune 500 companies to international corporations looking to expand into American markets. Last year alone, my firm generated over $60 million in revenue, and my personal net worth recently crossed the 50 million mark. But here's the thing. My husband Mark had absolutely no idea about any of this. To Mark Williams, my husband of 15 years, I was just Rachel, a freelance consultant who worked from home and traveled occasionally for small business clients. He believed I made maybe $40,000 or $50,000 a year on a good year, contributing what he considered a modest amount to our household expenses. In his mind, he was the provider, the successful one, the man who had built our comfortable lifestyle with his $85,000 salary as a mid-level operations manager at a logistics company. Mark is 48 years old, and for the past several years he's been going through what I can only describe as an extended midlife crisis. He started working out obsessively, buying expensive clothes that I paid for but he didn't know it, and talking constantly about his potential being wasted in his current job. He began viewing himself as some kind of corporate genius who was being held back by a lack of vision from his superiors, and increasingly by what he saw as my lack of ambition. The irony would have been hilarious if it wasn't so painful to watch. Here was a man who drove a BMW that I bought, lived in a penthouse that I owned, and enjoyed a lifestyle that my income funded, all while believing that he was the successful one in our marriage, and that I was somehow holding him back from achieving even greater things. Then there's Stephanie Martinez, 25 years old, who started working as Mark's secretary about 8 months ago. Stephanie is everything I'm not: young, bubbly, impressionable, and desperately eager to please. She has long blonde hair that she spends hours styling, a wardrobe of trendy clothes that she clearly can't afford on a secretary's salary, and the kind of wide-eyed admiration for Mark that fed his ego in ways I apparently no longer could. Stephanie saw Mark as her ticket to a better life. She saw his expensive suits, heard about the penthouse where he lived, noticed the luxury car he drove to work, and assumed she'd hit the jackpot when he started paying attention to her. What she didn't realize was that she was falling for a carefully constructed illusion, an illusion that I had unknowingly helped create by hiding my own success. My assistant and closest confidant is David Kim, 38, who's been with my company for 7 years. David knows everything about my business operations, my financial situation, and yes, he knows about the elaborate charade I've been maintaining at home. He's been the one helping me manage the complex web of business entities, personal accounts, and carefully structured finances that allowed me to support Mark's lifestyle while keeping him completely in the dark about where the money actually came from. David has been urging me for years to be honest with Mark about my success. "Rachel," he would say during our weekly strategy meetings, "this isn't sustainable. You're building resentment by pretending to be less than you are, and he's building arrogance by believing he's more than he is. This is going to explode eventually." But I was terrified of Mark's reaction. My first serious relationship back in my 20s had been with a man who became increasingly hostile and controlling when my career started outpacing his. I learned to hide my achievements, downplay my successes, and make myself smaller to preserve the relationship. Even after that relationship ended badly, the pattern stuck. I convinced myself that I was being generous and selfless by letting Mark believe he was the provider, but I was actually being dishonest and enabling his delusions. My sister Nina Chen Rodriguez, 42, is one of Chicago's most prominent family law attorneys. She's always known about my business success, and she's been watching my marriage with growing concern for years. Nina has seen too many cases where financial deception, even well-intentioned deception, destroys relationships and families. "Rachel, you're not protecting your marriage by lying about who you are," Nina would tell me during our monthly sister dinners. "You're protecting Mark's ego at the expense of your own authenticity. What happens when he finds out?" And he will find out eventually. But I thought I could maintain the balance indefinitely. I thought I could keep supporting Mark's lifestyle and his ego while building my business empire in the shadows. I thought I was being the perfect wife by making him feel successful and important, even if it meant denying my own achievements. Our life in Chicago looked perfect from the outside. We lived in a stunning penthouse in the Gold Coast neighborhood, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan and the city skyline. The apartment was worth over $2 million, though Mark believed we were just renting it for a fraction of what the mortgage payments actually cost me. Our building had a doorman, a fitness center, and a rooftop deck where we hosted dinner parties with Mark's colleagues, parties where I played the role of the supportive wife who was impressed by her husband's success. Mark drove a BMW X5 that he believed was a company car with personal use privileges. In reality, I had purchased it through one of my business entities and structured it to look like a corporate benefit. When his friends complimented him on his company car, Mark would smile proudly and talk about the perks of being valued by his employer. Our lifestyle included regular vacations that Mark thought were funded by his bonuses and my occasional good months as a consultant. We'd travel to Europe, stay in 5-star hotels, and dine at Michelin-starred restaurants, all while Mark basked in the role of the generous provider, treating his wife to luxuries she couldn't afford on her own. The clothing, the gadgets, the expensive dinners out, the wine collection, the artwork in our apartment. All of it was funded by my business success, but Mark believed it was evidence of his own prosperity and good financial management. I had become so skilled at hiding money that I sometimes wondered if I was committing some kind of elaborate fraud against my own husband. But the most painful part wasn't the financial deception. It was watching Mark become increasingly condescending toward me and my work. He would dismiss my business trips as little consulting gigs, joke with his friends about how I played around with small businesses, and frequently suggest that I should find a real job with more stable income and better benefits. The irony was devastating. Here I was, running a multi-million-dollar company, making decisions that affected hundreds of employees and dozens of major corporations, and my own husband saw me as an underachiever who needed his guidance and support to reach my potential. Meanwhile, Stephanie was feeding Mark's ego in ways that I had apparently stopped doing years ago. She would listen to his complaints about work with rapt attention, agree with his assessment that his talents were being wasted, and gradually convince him that he deserved a woman who truly appreciated his success and ambition. What Mark didn't realize was that Stephanie wasn't falling in love with him. She was falling in love with the lifestyle she thought he could provide. She wasn't impressed by his character or his intelligence. She was impressed by the BMW, the penthouse address, and the expensive restaurants where he took her for their secret lunch dates. And what Stephanie didn't realize was that she was fighting for a life that didn't actually belong to the man she was sleeping with. She was planning to steal a lifestyle that I had built, funded by money I had earned, supported by success I had achieved, while pretending to be someone much smaller and less capable than I really was. The stage was set for a collision that would destroy all of our carefully constructed illusions. Mark's growing arrogance and entitlement, Stephanie's gold-digging ambitions, and my own exhaustion with living a lie were about to create the perfect storm that would reveal the truth about all of us. What none of us expected was how devastating that truth would be, not just for Mark and Stephanie, who were about to lose everything they thought they had gained, but for me as well, as I was forced to confront the price I had paid for 15 years of hiding who I really was. This is the story of what happens when kindness is mistaken for weakness, when generosity is repaid with betrayal, and when the truth finally comes out in the most explosive way possible. It's the story of how my cheating husband and his pregnant mistress learned that sometimes the quiet woman you underestimate is actually the one holding all the cards. The morning I discovered my husband's affair, I was returning from what Mark believed was a small consulting job in Minneapolis. In reality, I had just closed a $12 million deal with a manufacturing company looking to expand their operations into 3 new states. The contract would keep my team busy for the next 18 months and would add another substantial sum to my already considerable portfolio. As my Uber pulled up to our building on North Lake Shore Drive, I felt that familiar mix of exhaustion and satisfaction that came after a successful business trip. I had spent 3 days in back-to-back meetings, presentations, and negotiations, representing my company with the kind of confidence and authority that had built my reputation in the consulting world. But as we approached our building, I was already mentally switching back into the role I played at home, the modest freelance consultant who was grateful for her husband's financial support. Our doorman, Carlos, greeted me with his usual warm smile. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Williams. Mr. Williams is upstairs. He's been expecting you." I thanked Carlos and made my way to the elevator, already thinking about how I would describe my trip to Mark. I would tell him about the meetings, but downplay their significance. I would mention that the client seemed pleased, but I wouldn't reveal the size of the contract or the scope of the project. This careful editing of my professional life had become second nature after 15 years of practice. The elevator ride to the 32nd floor gave me time to decompress and prepare for the transition from CEO Rachel to homemaker Rachel. It was a mental shift I had perfected over the years, though it was becoming increasingly exhausting to maintain. Sometimes I wondered what it would be like to come home and share my real victories with my husband, to have him understand the magnitude of what I had accomplished, and feel proud of my success rather than threatened by it. Our penthouse apartment was a testament to the lifestyle that my hidden income had made possible. the moment you stepped off the elevator into our private foyer, you were greeted by floor-to-ceiling windows that offered breathtaking views of Lake Michigan and the Chicago skyline. The living room featured Italian leather furniture that Mark believed we had gotten at a significant discount through one of his work connections, but which I had actually purchased at full retail price through one of my business accounts. The kitchen was a chef's dream, with custom cabinetry, marble countertops, and professional-grade appliances that Mark thought were included in our rental package. The master bedroom suite included a walk-in closet that was larger than most people's bedrooms, filled with designer clothing that Mark assumed I had accumulated slowly over the years, through careful shopping and good sales. Every room in our apartment told the story of a successful, affluent couple, but the narrative Mark had constructed about how we could afford this lifestyle was completely fictional. He believed that his $85,000 salary, combined with my supposed $30,000 to $40,000 in consulting income, and what he assumed was excellent financial management on his part, had created our comfortable life. The reality was that our monthly expenses exceeded Mark's entire annual salary. The mortgage on our penthouse was $8,000 a month. The parking fees for our 2 cars added another $600. The homeowners association fees, insurance, utilities, and maintenance costs brought our housing expenses alone to nearly $10,000 monthly. Then there were the cars, the insurance, the dining out, the vacations, the clothing, and all the other elements of our lifestyle that Mark took for granted. I had structured our finances so carefully that Mark never saw the real numbers. He had access to what he believed were our joint checking and savings accounts. But these were actually just small accounts that I funded monthly to cover his personal expenses and give him the illusion of financial transparency. The real money flowed through a complex network of business accounts, investment portfolios, and financial instruments that remained completely invisible to him. Mark's lack of curiosity about our finances had always puzzled me. For a man who prided himself on being smart and successful, he showed remarkably little interest in understanding how we could afford our lifestyle on what he believed was our combined income. When I had tried to discuss financial planning or investment strategies in the early years of our marriage, he would wave off the conversation, saying he trusted me to handle the details while he focused on the big picture of his career advancement. Over the years, I had watched Mark become increasingly entitled and condescending, not just toward me, but toward others he perceived as less successful than himself. He would make comments about people who hadn't achieved much or who weren't reaching their potential, completely oblivious to the fact that his own lifestyle was entirely dependent on achievements he knew nothing about. His attitude toward my work had become particularly painful to endure. Mark would introduce me at social gatherings as someone who does some consulting work on the side, always emphasizing the word side, as if my career was a hobby rather than a serious profession. When his colleagues' wives talked about their jobs, Mark would sometimes joke that I was still figuring out what I want to be when I grow up, a comment that never failed to sting, especially since I was actually running a company with over 200 employees. The transformation in Mark's personality had been gradual but unmistakable. The man I had married 15 years ago had been more humble, more appreciative, and more genuinely interested in building a life together. But as our lifestyle had improved, thanks to my hidden success, Mark had begun to see himself as the architect of our prosperity. He started talking about providing for his wife, building wealth, and creating security for our family, all while remaining completely unaware of where our security actually came from. His interactions with service workers, restaurant staff, and even our building's employees had become noticeably more arrogant over the years. He would speak down to people, make demanding requests, and generally behave like someone who believed his own importance was self-evident. It was painful to watch the man I loved transform into someone I sometimes didn't recognize. Meanwhile, my own professional life was reaching new heights that I couldn't share with the person closest to me. Chen Consulting Group had been recognized by Incore magazine as one of the fastest-growing companies in the Midwest. I had been invited to speak at conferences, had been featured in business publications, and had built a reputation as one of the most innovative thinkers in organizational development and strategic planning. But at home, I was just Rachel, the wife who did a little consulting, and who was fortunate to have a husband successful enough to support their comfortable lifestyle. The cognitive dissonance was becoming unbearable. But I was trapped by my own deception and by my fear of what the truth would do to our marriage. My assistant David had been increasingly concerned about the toll this double life was taking on me. During our weekly meetings, he would notice my exhaustion, my growing frustration, and my decreasing enthusiasm for achievements that I couldn't properly celebrate. "Rachel, you're burning out," he told me during a meeting just 2 weeks before my world would explode. "You're building an incredible business empire, but you can't even acknowledge your own success at home. That's not sustainable, and it's not healthy." David had met Mark a few times at company events that I had carefully positioned as networking opportunities, rather than events honoring my own achievements. He had watched Mark's condescending attitude toward me and my work, and he couldn't understand why I tolerated it. "He talks to you like you're his employee rather than his wife," David had observed, "and not even a respected employee, more like an intern he's mentoring. How do you stand it?" But I kept believing that I was protecting our marriage by maintaining the illusion. I convinced myself that Mark's ego was fragile and that revealing my success would emasculate him and destroy our relationship. I told myself that I was being loving and generous by allowing him to feel important and successful, even if it meant diminishing my own achievements. My sister Nina had been watching this dynamic with growing alarm. As a family law attorney, she had seen too many cases where financial deception, even well-intentioned deception, had destroyed marriages and families. She had been urging me for years to be honest with Mark about my success, warning me that the longer I waited, the more devastating the eventual revelation would be. "Rachel, you're not being kind to Mark by lying to him," Nina had told me during our last conversation before everything fell apart. "You're enabling his worst instincts and setting up a situation where he's going to feel completely betrayed when he finds out. And he will find out eventually." But I thought I could maintain the balance indefinitely. I thought I was clever enough to keep funding our lifestyle while letting Mark believe he was the provider. I thought I was being the perfect wife by making him feel successful and important, even if it meant living a lie. What I didn't anticipate was that my generosity would be interpreted as weakness, that my desire to protect Mark's ego would make him feel entitled to more than I was already giving him, and that someone else would come along who seemed to appreciate his success more than I did. The warning signs had been there for months, but I had been too busy managing my business and maintaining my facade to pay proper attention to what was happening in my own marriage. Mark had been working later, spending more time on his phone, and becoming increasingly critical of me and our relationship. He started complaining that I was too independent, too focused on work, and not supportive enough of his ambitions. The irony was devastating. Here I was, funding every aspect of his life while pretending to be financially dependent on him, and he was criticizing me for being too independent. I was supporting his every comfort and luxury while hiding my own achievements, and he was accusing me of not being supportive of his ambitions. As I stood in the elevator that afternoon, returning from my successful business trip and preparing to downplay my achievements once again, I had no idea that within minutes, my carefully constructed world would begin to crumble in ways I never could have anticipated. The truth was about to come out, but not in the way I had always feared. Instead of Mark discovering my deception, I was about to discover his, and the revelation would force both of us to confront who we really were, beneath the lies we had been telling ourselves and each other. The moment I stepped through our front door, I knew something was fundamentally wrong. The apartment felt different, not just quieter, but charged with an energy that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. There were subtle changes that most people might have missed, but after 15 years of living in this space, I noticed everything. A pair of women's shoes by the entrance that weren't mine, a handbag on the console table that I'd never seen before, the faint scent of a perfume that was sweeter and younger than anything I wore. "Mark?" I called out, setting down my luggage and trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm home." "We're in the living room," came his response, and the word "we" hit me like a physical blow. I walked toward the living room on unsteady legs, my mind racing through possible explanations, even as my heart was already accepting the truth I didn't want to face. When I rounded the corner, the scene before me was like something out of a nightmare that I had never allowed myself to imagine. Mark was sitting on our Italian leather sofa, the one I had bought last year as a surprise for our anniversary, with a young blonde woman curled up beside him like she belonged there. She was wearing a silk robe that I recognized as one of mine, her long hair cascading over her shoulders, and her hand resting possessively on Mark's thigh. But what stopped my breath entirely was what I saw on the coffee table. Divorce papers, neatly arranged and clearly already prepared, with Mark's signature bold and confident at the bottom. "Rachel," Mark said, standing up with the kind of practiced confidence that suggested he had rehearsed this moment. "We need to talk." The young woman, who I now realized must be Stephanie, his secretary, smiled at me with a mixture of triumph and false sympathy that made my stomach turn. She was beautiful in that fresh, uncomplicated way that 25-year-old women are beautiful, all smooth skin and bright eyes, and the kind of confidence that comes from never having been truly tested by life. "This is Stephanie," Mark continued, as if he was introducing me to a dinner guest rather than his mistress. "I'm sure you've heard me mention her." I had heard him mention her, actually. For months, Mark had been talking about his new secretary, how smart she was, how much more efficiently the office ran since she'd started, how refreshing it was to work with someone who really understood the business world. I had even encouraged these conversations, happy that Mark seemed to be enjoying his work more and feeling supported in his professional environment. "Mark, what is this?" I managed to ask, though my voice sounded foreign to my own ears. "This is me finally taking control of my life," Mark replied, picking up the divorce papers and holding them out to me like a gift. "I'm filing for divorce, Rachel. This marriage has been over for a long time, and we both know it." I stared at the papers without taking them, my mind struggling to process what was happening. "We both know it. Mark, what are you talking about? We never even discussed problems in our marriage, let alone divorce." Stephanie laughed, a sound like tinkling bells that was probably charming under different circumstances, but now felt like nails on a chalkboard. "Oh, honey, Mark's been talking about the problems in your marriage for months. You two just aren't compatible anymore." The casual way she called me honey, the proprietary way she spoke about my marriage, the comfortable way she was sitting in my living room wearing my robe. It all hit me at once, like a series of slaps. "How long has this been going on?" I asked, looking directly at Mark. "Does it matter?" Mark shrugged, his attitude casual and dismissive. "The point is, we want to move forward with our lives, and that means you need to move out." "Move out?" I repeated, the words not making sense. "Mark, this is my home." "Our home," Mark corrected, his tone becoming condescending in a way that was painfully familiar. "And since I'm the one who's been paying for it, I think it's fair that I should be the one to stay." Stephanie nodded supportively, her hand moving to rest on what I now noticed was a small but unmistakable baby bump beneath the silk robe. "We're going to need the space anyway. We're having a baby." The room spun around me as this final piece of information registered. Not only was my husband leaving me for his secretary, but she was pregnant with his child. They had been planning a future together while I was traveling for work, building the business that unknowingly funded the very lifestyle that had attracted her to him in the first place. "A baby," I whispered, sinking into the nearest chair. "Yes, and we want to get married as soon as possible," Mark continued, his voice gaining energy as he spoke about his plans. "Stephanie deserves to have a proper wedding and a stable home for our child. We've already talked to a lawyer about expediting the divorce." "You've already talked to a lawyer?" I looked up at Mark, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in years. "You planned all of this without saying a word to me about any problems in our marriage. Rachel, come on. You had to know this wasn't working." Mark's tone was becoming impatient, like I was being deliberately obtuse. "You're always traveling for work. You never want to stay in and just be together, and you've made it clear that you don't want children. Stephanie appreciates what I can provide for a family." "What you can provide," I repeated, my mind catching on that phrase. "Yes," Stephanie chimed in, her voice bright with enthusiasm. "Mark has been so generous, taking me to all those wonderful restaurants, showing me around the city. I've never been with a man who could provide such a nice lifestyle." She gestured around our apartment, her eyes taking in the expensive furniture, the original artwork, the panoramic views that had cost me millions to secure. "This apartment is incredible, Mark. Our baby is going to love growing up here." "Our baby," Mark agreed, smiling at Stephanie with a tenderness I hadn't seen from him in years. "It'll be good to have children in this place finally. Make it feel like a real home." The casual cruelty of that comment, the implication that our 15-year marriage hadn't made this place a real home, cut deeper than I expected. But it was the assumption about financial provision that was causing a different kind of pain to build in my chest. "Mark," I said carefully, "when you talk about providing for Stephanie and the baby, what exactly do you mean?" Mark straightened up, his chest puffing out with pride. "I mean that I have a good job, I make good money, and I can support my family in the style they deserve. Stephanie won't have to work if she doesn't want to. She can focus on being a mother and a wife." Stephanie beamed at him adoringly. "Mark's been telling me about his position at the company, about his salary, and his potential for advancement. I've never dated a man who was so successful and stable." I looked between them, these two people who had built their entire relationship on a foundation of lies. Lies that I had inadvertently helped create by hiding my own success for 15 years. They were planning a future based on Mark's supposed wealth and status, completely unaware that every luxury they were enjoying was funded by the woman they were so casually discarding. "And what about me?" I asked. Where exactly do you expect me to go? Mark waved his hand dismissively. Don't worry about money. I'll pay alimony since you've never really contributed much financially anyway. You can get a small apartment, maybe find a more stable job. This might actually be good for you. Push you to really apply yourself professionally for once. The condescension in his voice was breathtaking. Here was a man who had been living off my income for 15 years, lecturing me about professional achievement and financial contribution. The irony would have been funny if it wasn't so devastating. You'll pay alimony? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Of course. I'm not heartless, Rachel. I know your consulting work is inconsistent, and you're not getting any younger. It might be hard for you to find something stable at your age. Mark's tone was magnanimous, like he was bestowing a great favor upon me. Stephanie nodded sympathetically. Mark is being so generous. He could easily argue that 15 years is long enough for you to have established yourself professionally. Established myself professionally, I repeated, tasting the words. Right, Mark continued, warming to his subject. I mean, I've supported your little consulting projects all these years, but it's time for you to stand on your own feet. Think of this as an opportunity for growth. My little consulting projects. My opportunity for growth. I looked at this man who had shared my bed for 15 years, who had benefited from my success while remaining completely oblivious to it, who was now lecturing me about professional achievement while planning to marry a woman who was attracted to wealth that didn't belong to him. So let me make sure I understand this correctly, Wow, I said, my voice becoming stronger as a strange calm settled over me. You want me to move out of this apartment so that you and Stephanie can live here and raise your baby. You believe that you'll be able to support this lifestyle on your salary, and you're generously offering to pay me alimony from that same salary to help me get established professionally. Exactly, Mark said, relief evident in his voice that I was finally understanding the situation. I knew you'd be reasonable about this once you heard the whole plan. Stephanie squeezed Mark's hand supportively. We really appreciate you being so mature about everything. Some women would make this much more difficult. I looked around the apartment that I had bought and paid for, at the furniture I had selected and the artwork I had commissioned, at the life I had built while pretending that someone else was building it. I thought about my company, my employees, my clients, my bank accounts, my investments, my properties, all the evidence of success that I had hidden so carefully that even my own husband didn't know it existed. And in that moment, looking at these two people who had betrayed me while planning to steal a life they hadn't earned, I made a decision that would change all of our lives forever. You know what, Mark? I said, standing up and smoothing down my skirt. You're absolutely right. It's time for all of us to face reality. Mark smiled, clearly pleased with how well this conversation was going. I'm glad you're being so understanding about this. Oh, I understand perfectly, I replied, my voice steady and calm. And I think it's time for both of you to understand a few things as well. But instead of revealing the truth in that moment, I decided to let them discover it the hard way. After all, they seemed so confident in their plans, so certain about their future. It would be interesting to see how long their confidence lasted when reality began to intrude on their fantasy. The calm that settled over me in that moment was unlike anything I had ever experienced. For 15 years, I had been living in fear of Mark's reaction to my success, fear of his ego being bruised, fear of losing the marriage I had worked so hard to protect. But sitting there, watching my husband and his pregnant mistress plan their future with my money in my apartment, all of that fear simply evaporated. In its place was something much more powerful: clarity. You know what? I said, standing up and straightening my shoulders. You're absolutely right, Mark. It is time for all of us to face reality. And I think the best way to do that is for me to give you exactly what you're asking for. Mark's relief was palpable. I knew you'd be reasonable about this once you had time to process everything. Stephanie squeezed his hand and smiled at me with what she probably thought was gracious sympathy. This is really the best thing for everyone involved. You'll see. I'm sure I will, I replied, my voice steady. You want me out of the apartment by Friday? That's 5 days from now. Consider it done. Really? Mark seemed almost surprised by how easily I was accepting his demands. Just like that? Just like that, I confirmed. After all, you're right about so many things. You should be the one to stay here since you've been providing for this lifestyle. I let a small smile play at the corners of my mouth. And Stephanie deserves to enjoy all the comforts that your success has made possible. Stephanie practically glowed with happiness. Thank you for being so understanding, Rachel. I know this can't be easy, but you're doing the right thing. Oh, I'm absolutely doing the right thing, I agreed. In fact, I'm going to do everything I can to make sure you both get exactly what you deserve. Mark stood up and extended his hand to me, as if we were closing a business deal. I appreciate you being so mature about this. I know we can handle the divorce proceedings civilly. I looked at his outstretched hand for a moment before shaking it. Civilly. Yes, I think that's exactly the right approach. As soon as they left the apartment, Mark was taking Stephanie to dinner at one of our favorite restaurants, though he didn't realize yet that the credit card he planned to use was funded by my accounts. I began making the phone calls that would change all of our lives. My first call was to David. Rachel, how was Minneapolis? David's familiar voice was comforting after the surreal conversation I had just endured. Minneapolis was successful. $12 million contract signed and executed. But David, I need you to do something for me. And I need it done by Friday. Okay. David's tone shifted to business mode. What do you need? I need you to remove Mark's name from everything. Every account, every credit card, every service, every contract. If his name is on it, I want it removed. If he has access to it, I want that access revoked. Everything goes back to being in my name only. There was a pause. Rachel, what happened? My husband is divorcing me for his pregnant secretary. He wants me out of the apartment by Friday so they can start their new life together. He's generously offered to pay me alimony from his salary to help me get established professionally. His salary? David's voice was incredulous. Rachel, his salary wouldn't cover the monthly expenses on your apartment alone. I know that. You know that. But Mark and Stephanie don't know that. And I've decided to let them find out the hard way. Are you sure about this approach? It's going to be dramatic. David, I've spent 15 years making myself smaller to protect a man's ego. I've hidden my success, downplayed my achievements, and funded a lifestyle that he believes he created through his own hard work. And how has he repaid that generosity? By cheating on me with his secretary, and then lecturing me about my lack of professional achievement. I walked to the window, looking out at the Chicago skyline that had been the backdrop for so many of my hidden triumphs. I'm done being small. I'm done hiding. And I'm definitely done protecting people who don't deserve protection. What do you want me to do about the apartment? Call the leasing company. Mark believes we're renting, but we both know I own this unit outright. Have them serve notice that the lease is terminated. Give them until Friday to vacate. Rachel, that's going to leave them homeless. No, David, that's going to leave them exactly where they chose to be, together, and dependent on Mark's actual income rather than mine. My second call was to my sister Nina. "Rachel, how was your trip?" Nina's voice was warm and familiar. "My trip was fine. My marriage is over. I need you to represent me in a divorce." "What happened?" I told her the whole story, coming home to find Stephanie in our apartment, the divorce papers already prepared, Mark's assumptions about alimony and financial support, their plans to raise a baby in the apartment that I owned with money that I had earned. "Rachel, I'm so sorry. But I have to ask, are you sure you want to handle this the way you're describing? It's going to be a shock for both of them." "Nina, I've been thinking about this for the past hour, and I've never been more certain of anything in my life. For 15 years, I've been enabling Mark's delusions about his own importance and success. I thought I was being kind, but I was actually being dishonest, and that dishonesty has led to this moment, where he feels entitled to take everything I've built and give it to another woman. What do you want the settlement terms to be?" "I want him to have exactly what he brought to this marriage, his personal belongings and his salary. Everything else stays with me because everything else is mine. And Nina, I want the real financial disclosure documents prepared. Every business, every account, every property. I want him to see exactly what he's losing and why. Are you prepared for his reaction when he realizes the truth?" I thought about that question seriously. Mark's reaction would be devastating. Not just his shock at learning about my wealth, but his humiliation at realizing that his identity as the successful provider had been built on a lie. It would destroy his ego in ways that might take years to recover from. "Yes," I said finally, "I'm prepared, because the alternative is continuing to live a lie, and I can't do that anymore." My third call was to building management. "Hello, this is Rachel Chen. I own Unit 3201. I need to make some changes to the account." "Of course, Ms. Chen. What can we help you with?" "I need Mark Williams removed from all building access and communications. He should no longer be listed as an authorized person on the account." "We can certainly make those changes. Should we send him a notification about the access change?" "No notification necessary. He'll figure it out." My fourth call was to the credit card companies, the car insurance company, the utilities, and every other service that Mark believed we shared. In each case, I explained that I needed to remove an authorized user from my accounts. The process was surprisingly simple, since everything had always been in my name to begin with. Mark's access to our lifestyle had been entirely dependent on my continued generosity that I was no longer willing to extend to someone who had betrayed me so completely. As I made these calls, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. For the first time in 15 years, I didn't have to pretend to be less successful than I was. I didn't have to hide my achievements or downplay my intelligence. I could be exactly who I was without fear of threatening someone's fragile ego. My final call was to a real estate agent who specialized in luxury temporary housing. "I need a furnished studio apartment for a few weeks while I figure out my next move," I told her. "Something modest but comfortable, and I need it by Thursday night." The studio apartment I rented was a deliberate choice, small, simple, and the kind of place that would reinforce Mark and Stephanie's assumptions about my limited means. I wanted them to think I was struggling, at least initially. The truth would be much more impactful when it came from an official source rather than from me. As I packed my personal belongings that evening, I felt a strange sense of liberation. I was taking only what was truly mine: my clothes, my jewelry, my personal photographs, and a few books that had sentimental value. Everything else in the apartment, The furniture, the artwork, the electronics, the wine collection, I was leaving behind for Mark and Stephanie to enjoy, for exactly as long as it took for reality to catch up with them. I left a note on the kitchen counter, next to the divorce papers that Mark had given me. Mark, I've signed the divorce papers and I'll be out by Friday as requested. Since you believe you've been providing for our lifestyle all these years, I'm sure you'll have no trouble maintaining it on your own. I've taken only my personal belongings. Everything else is yours to figure out. Wishing you and Stephanie all the happiness you deserve. Rachel. The note was carefully worded to reinforce their assumptions while hinting at the challenges to come. I wanted them to feel confident and secure, right up until the moment their world started crumbling around them. As I closed the door of our apartment for what I knew would be the last time, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: excitement about the future. For the first time since my marriage began, I was going to be able to live as my authentic self, without hiding or diminishing my success to protect someone else's feelings. The next few weeks were going to be difficult for everyone involved, but they were also going to be revelatory. Mark and Stephanie were about to learn some hard truths about assumptions, entitlement, and the difference between lifestyle and wealth, and I was about to learn what it felt like to stop apologizing for being successful. The first crack in Mark and Stephanie's perfect new world appeared exactly 72 hours after I moved out. I was sitting in my modest studio apartment, working on a proposal for a new client, when my phone rang. It was Mark, and his voice carried a note of confusion that I hadn't heard from him in years. Rachel, there's some kind of mistake with the credit cards. They've all been declined, and when I called the bank, they said my access had been revoked. Can you call them and sort this out? I set down my laptop and smiled. I'm sorry, Mark, but there's no mistake. Those were my credit cards. You were just an authorized user. What do you mean, your credit cards? We've been using those cards for years. Yes, you have been using them, but they were always mine. I added you as an authorized user when we got married, but since we're getting divorced, I removed your access. There was a long pause. Rachel, that's not possible. How could you have credit cards with those kinds of limits on your income? That's a very good question, Mark. I'm sure you'll figure it out. I hung up before he could respond, knowing that this was just the beginning of their education. The second crack appeared the next morning, when Stephanie called me in a panic. Rachel, there's a man here saying we need to vacate the apartment. He says the lease has been terminated. This has to be some kind of mistake. No mistake, Stephanie. I'm the owner of that apartment, not a renter. Since I'm no longer living there, I've decided to sell it. You're the owner? Stephanie's voice climbed several octaves. But Mark said you were both on the lease. Mark was incorrect about many things. You might want to ask him about his actual financial situation. What do you mean, his actual financial situation? I mean, you should probably ask him how he plans to afford a $10,000 a month lifestyle on an $85,000 a year salary. This time, Stephanie hung up on me. Over the next week, I watched from a distance as Mark and Stephanie's perfect life unraveled piece by piece. David kept me updated on their increasingly frantic attempts to understand what was happening to them. First, Mark's BMW was repossessed. He called the financing company, confused about why they were taking a car that he believed was a company vehicle. When they explained that the loan had been guaranteed by Chen Consulting Group and that the guarantor had withdrawn their backing, Mark's confusion deepened. He had never heard of Chen Consulting Group. Then their internet, cable, and utilities were shut off for non-payment. Mark had never seen the actual bills for these services because they had always been automatically paid from my business accounts. When he tried to set up new service in his name, he was shocked to discover that the monthly costs exceeded his weekly take-home pay. The luxury items in the apartment, the wine collection, the artwork, the high-end electronics, were all removed by a moving company that had been hired to prepare the space for sale. Mark tried to argue that these items belonged to him, but when the mover showed him the ownership documentation, every piece was registered to Chen Consulting Group or to my personal holdings. But the real revelation came when Stephanie, in her desperation to understand what was happening, decided to Google my name. Mark, I imagine her saying, staring at her phone in disbelief. You need to see this. The Google search results for Rachel Chen Chicago were extensive and enlightening. There was my LinkedIn profile, listing me as the founder and CEO of Chen Consulting Group. There was the Forbes article about Chicago's most successful female entrepreneurs, featuring a photo of me in my office. There was the Inkwrause magazine profile about women who built million-dollar companies before age 40. But the most damaging article was probably the one from Chicago Business Journal. Chen Consulting Group reports record revenue of $60 million, with a sidebar mentioning my personal net worth and my reputation as one of the city's most successful business leaders. Stephanie called me again, her voice shaking with a mixture of rage and disbelief. You're worth $50 million? The published estimates are a bit low, actually. But yes, I've been quite successful in my business. And Mark had no idea? Mark had no idea because I didn't want him to have any idea. I thought I was protecting our marriage by letting him believe he was the successful one. You mean, all this time, the apartment, the cars, the lifestyle, was funded by my business success, yes. Mark's salary wouldn't cover the monthly expenses on that apartment for even 1 week. There was a long silence. Then, he told me he was successful. He told me he could provide for our family. Mark told you what he believed to be true. Unfortunately, what he believed was based on 15 years of carefully constructed fiction. When David arrived at my former apartment the next day to serve the official divorce papers, he found Mark sitting on the living room floor surrounded by financial documents, trying to make sense of numbers that didn't add up. Stephanie was packing her belongings, tears streaming down her face as she realized that her dreams of a luxurious lifestyle had been built on someone else's money. The divorce papers David delivered were unlike anything Mark had expected. Instead of the simple asset division he had anticipated, these documents revealed the true scope of my financial empire. Pages and pages of business holdings, real estate investments, stock portfolios, and bank accounts, all in my name, all built during our marriage, all completely unknown to him. She owns the consulting company that's been in the news? Mark asked David, his voice barely above a whisper. Rachel founded Chen Consulting Group in her 2nd year of marriage to you, David confirmed. It's one of the most successful firms in the Midwest. But she always said she just did small consulting jobs. She said she made maybe $40,000 a year. Mr. Williams, your wife's company generates more than $60 million in annual revenue. Her personal income last year was more than your lifetime earnings to date. Mark's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and finally, a dawning horror, as he began to understand the magnitude of what he had given up. The alimony she's offering, David continued, consulting his notes, is $50,000. Total. Not annually. Total. She's being quite generous, considering that your adultery voids any claim to spousal support under Illinois law. 50,000? Stephanie looked up from her packing, but Mark said he was going to pay her alimony. I'm afraid Mr. Williams was mistaken about many aspects of his financial situation, David replied diplomatically. That evening, Mark called me directly. His voice was different than I had ever heard it, smaller, defeated, stripped of the arrogance that had characterized his behavior for years. "Rachel, I need to understand what happened. How is this possible? How could you have built a business empire without me knowing about it?" "Mark, I built that business by working 80-hour weeks while pretending to you that I was barely employed. I built it by taking on massive challenges and responsibilities while telling you that I was just doing little consulting projects. I built it by being excellent at what I do while allowing you to believe that you were the successful one in our marriage. But why? Why would you hide something like this from me?" "Because I was afraid of your reaction. I was afraid that if you knew how successful I was, you would feel threatened or emasculated. I thought I was protecting your ego and our marriage by making myself smaller. And instead, you were, what? Lying to me for 15 years? I was enabling your delusions for 15 years, Mark. I was allowing you to believe that you were providing a lifestyle that you couldn't actually afford, supporting achievements that weren't actually yours, and building wealth that didn't actually exist." There was a long pause. The apartment, the cars, the vacations, all funded by my income. Your salary wouldn't have covered our monthly expenses even if we had lived modestly. Jesus, Rachel, do you have any idea how this makes me feel? Do you have any idea how it felt to listen to you lecture me about professional achievement while I was secretly running a company? Do you know how it felt to hear you dismiss my work as little consulting projects while I was closing million-dollar deals? Do you understand what it was like to watch you become arrogant and entitled based on success that wasn't yours?" Mark was quiet for a long moment. "I never meant to make you feel bad about your work." "Mark, you didn't just make me feel bad about my work. You made me feel like I had to hide who I was to keep you happy. And even that wasn't enough, was it? Even with all of that sacrifice and deception, you still chose to leave me for someone else. I thought, I believed. You believed what you wanted to believe. You wanted to see yourself as the successful provider, so you accepted a reality that confirmed that view, even though it made no mathematical sense. What about Stephanie? She's pregnant, Rachel. What you need, Mark, is to figure out how to support a family on your actual income. What Stephanie needs is to understand that the lifestyle she was expecting isn't available through you. Can we work something out? Some kind of settlement that would help us get established? For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. This man who had been so confident, so condescending, so certain of his own importance, was now begging his ex-wife for financial help after trying to steal her life. "Mark, I'm offering you $50,000, which is more than you deserve given the circumstances. I suggest you take it and use it to start building a life that's actually within your means. $50,000 won't even cover a down payment on a decent apartment. Then maybe you shouldn't be looking at decent apartments, Mark. Maybe you should be looking at apartments that people with your income can actually afford." The conversation ended with Mark finally understanding that his fantasy life was over and his real life was about to begin. For the first time in 15 years, he was going to have to live within his actual means, support his family with his actual income, and face the reality of who he was without the cushion of someone else's success. As for Stephanie, she made her own phone call to me the next day. "Rachel, I owe you an apology. I had no idea about any of this. Mark told me he was successful, and I believed him. Stephanie, Mark wasn't deliberately lying to you. He was telling you what he believed to be true. But still, I participated in breaking up your marriage based on completely false information. I feel terrible. You feel terrible because your comfortable future just disappeared, not because you broke up my marriage. There was a pause. That's fair. But what am I supposed to do now? I'm pregnant, and Mark can't support the lifestyle he promised me. That, Stephanie, is between you and Mark. But I will say this. Maybe this experience will teach you that it's better to build your own success than to try to marry into someone else's. 2 weeks later, I heard through David that Stephanie had moved back in with her parents and was reconsidering her relationship with Mark. Apparently, the reality of his actual financial situation was quite different from the fantasy she had fallen in love with. Mark, meanwhile, had moved into a studio apartment that cost him 60% of his monthly income and was desperately trying to pick up freelance work to supplement his salary. For the first time in 15 years, both of them were living in the real world instead of the fantasy world that my hidden success had created. And for the first time in 15 years, I was free to be exactly who I was, without apology or pretense. 6 months after my divorce was finalized, I was sitting in my new penthouse office overlooking the Chicago River, reviewing the quarterly reports that showed Chen Consulting Group had achieved its most profitable year to date. For the first time in 15 years, I was able to celebrate my professional achievements without hiding them, downplaying them, or pretending they belonged to someone else. The office itself was a statement of authenticity that I had never allowed myself before. Floor-to-ceiling windows, custom furniture, original artwork, and a view that reminded me every day of how far I had come. My employees had been thrilled when I moved the company headquarters to this prime location, though many of them were surprised to learn that our CEO had been living such a modest public life despite the company's massive success. I always wondered why you drove such a conservative car and dressed so understated, my marketing director had commented during our office warming party. Now I understand you were hiding in plain sight. That comment had struck me profoundly because it captured something essential about the choice I had made for 15 years. I hadn't just been hiding my wealth from Mark. I had been hiding my authentic self from the world, diminishing my presence to make others comfortable with my success. The most dramatic change in my life wasn't financial. It was psychological. For the first time since my early 20s, I was living as my complete, unedited self. I could talk about my business achievements, share my professional challenges, and celebrate my victories without worrying about threatening someone's ego or making them feel inadequate. I had started dating again, this time with complete transparency about my wealth and professional status. The difference in the quality of my relationships was remarkable. Instead of attracting men who wanted to feel superior to me, I was meeting partners who were excited by my success and wanted to build something together as equals. My current relationship with James, a federal prosecutor who earned his own substantial income and had built his own impressive career, was everything my marriage to Mark hadn't been. James celebrated my victories, consulted me on his own professional challenges, and never once suggested that I should make myself smaller to accommodate his ego. I don't understand how your ex-husband could have lived with you for 15 years and not known about your business, James had said after I told him the whole story. Didn't he ever wonder how you could afford your lifestyle? Didn't he ask questions about your work? He didn't ask questions because he didn't want to know the answers, I had replied. Asking questions would have forced him to confront the fact that his identity as the provider was based on fiction. The situation with Mark and Stephanie had continued to evolve in ways that were both predictable and surprising. Mark had indeed struggled to adjust to his actual financial reality. moving through a series of increasingly modest living situations as he tried to find something he could afford on his real income. The baby had been born, a daughter they named Emma, and her arrival had forced both Mark and Stephanie to confront the practical realities of raising a child without the financial cushion they had expected. Stephanie had broken up with Mark twice, moved back in with her parents, and eventually reconciled with him, but their relationship was strained by financial stress and the aftermath of their false expectations. Mark had tried several times to contact me, sometimes to apologize, sometimes to ask for financial help, and once to suggest that we try to reconcile. Each conversation revealed how little he understood about what had actually happened between us. "I know I made mistakes," he had said during our last phone call, "but I still don't understand why you felt like you had to lie to me about your success." "Mark, I didn't lie to you to hurt you. I lied to you because I was afraid of your reaction to my success. And ironically, your reaction to discovering my success proved that my fears were justified." "What do you mean?" "I mean that instead of being proud of what I built, instead of feeling grateful for the lifestyle I provided, instead of recognizing the sacrifices I made to protect your ego, you're focusing on feeling betrayed, that I didn't trust you with the truth. But Rachel, we could have been a team. We could have built something together." "Mark, we were never going to be a team as long as you needed to be the superior partner. You couldn't even handle the fictional version of me that I created to make you comfortable. How were you going to handle the real me?" That conversation had ended with Mark finally acknowledging something that gave me hope for his future growth. "I think I understand now why you felt like you had to hide. I think I would have felt threatened by your success, and I don't like that about myself." Stephanie's journey had been different but equally educational. After the initial shock and anger, she had taken a hard look at her own choices and motivations. She reached out to me several months after Emma was born, and our conversation was surprisingly honest and productive. "I want to apologize again for my part in everything that happened," she had said, "but I also want to thank you for the lesson you taught me, even though it was painful." What lesson was that? That I was looking for a man to provide me with a lifestyle instead of building my own life. I was attracted to what I thought Mark could give me, not to who he actually was. Stephanie had enrolled in night school to finish her degree and was working toward becoming a dental hygienist, a career that would give her the financial independence she had never prioritized before. "I never want to be dependent on someone else's income again," she had told me. "I want to be able to take care of myself and my daughter." The most profound change in my own life was the relationship I had developed with my sister, Nina. She had been watching my journey with professional interest and personal concern, and our conversations had helped me understand the psychological dynamics that had trapped me in such a destructive pattern. "Rachel, you spent 15 years trying to manage Mark's emotional reaction to your success instead of simply being successful and letting him manage his own emotions," Nina had observed. "You took responsibility for his feelings about your achievements, and that's not sustainable in any relationship." Nina had also helped me understand that my pattern of hiding my success wasn't unique. "I see this with successful women all the time," she had told me. They make themselves smaller to protect their partner's ego, and then they're surprised when their partner becomes entitled and takes them for granted. Through therapy and honest self-reflection, I had come to understand that my fear of threatening Mark's ego had actually prevented us from having a real marriage. By hiding who I was, I had made it impossible for him to love the real me, and I had made it impossible for me to feel truly known and accepted. The business implications of my new authenticity had been overwhelmingly positive. Chen Consulting Group had landed several major contracts specifically because clients wanted to work with me personally, having read about my expertise in various publications. My willingness to be publicly successful had actually enhanced my professional reputation and opened doors that had been closed while I was hiding. I had also started mentoring other successful women who were struggling with similar issues. Women who were hiding their achievements, downplaying their intelligence, or making themselves smaller to accommodate partners who felt threatened by their success. The right person will celebrate your success, not be diminished by it, I would tell them. If someone can't handle your achievements, that's information about them, not about you. 1 year after my divorce, I received an unexpected letter from Mark. He had been in therapy and was working to understand his own role in our relationship dynamics. The letter was thoughtful and reflective in ways that his previous communications hadn't been. "Rachel," he wrote, "I've been thinking a lot about our marriage and trying to understand how things went so wrong. I realize now that I created an environment where you felt like you had to hide your success from me, and I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry that my ego was so fragile, that you felt you couldn't be yourself around me. I'm sorry that I took credit for a lifestyle I didn't build and achievements I didn't earn. And I'm sorry that even when you were being incredibly generous to me, I interpreted it as evidence of my own importance rather than evidence of your love." The letter continued, "I know it's too late for us, and I understand why you wouldn't want to try again. But I want you to know that I'm working to become the kind of man who could be proud of a partner's success instead of threatened by it. Maybe someday I'll be worthy of someone like you, even if that someone isn't you." I had been surprised by the emotional impact of that letter, not because it made me want to reconcile with Mark, but because it showed me that growth and change were possible, even for someone who had been as blind to his own behavior as Mark had been. The final piece of my transformation had been purchasing a new home, a lakefront property in Lincoln Park that was unquestionably, unapologetically luxurious. After years of living modestly to maintain my fiction, I had decided to create a space that reflected my actual success and my authentic taste. The housewarming party I threw had been attended by my employees, my clients, my new friends, and my family, all people who knew and celebrated the real me. Standing in my beautiful home, surrounded by people who appreciated my success instead of being threatened by it, I had felt a completeness that I hadn't experienced since I was in my 20s. The most important lesson I learned from my experience was that authenticity isn't selfish. It's essential. When you hide who you are to make someone else comfortable, you're not being kind. You're being dishonest. And that dishonesty will eventually destroy the relationship you're trying to protect. I also learned that the right person doesn't need you to be smaller to feel bigger. The right person wants you to be exactly who you are, achievements and all, because they understand that your success doesn't diminish theirs. Today, I'm in a relationship with someone who knew about my wealth from our first conversation, who has celebrated every business victory with genuine enthusiasm, and who has never once suggested that I should downplay my achievements or hide my success. James actually brags about my accomplishments to his friends and colleagues, something Mark never did even when he believed my achievements were modest. The contrast has shown me what I was missing for 15 years, the joy of being truly known and loved for who I actually am. My advice to any woman who is hiding her success to protect someone else's ego is simple. Stop. The right person will be proud of your achievements, excited by your ambition, and grateful to be with someone who has built something meaningful. If someone can't handle your success, that's not your problem to solve by making yourself smaller. That's their problem to work through or walk away from. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's delusions about themselves. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply be authentically, unapologetically successful. Mark and Stephanie learned that assumption and entitlement are expensive teachers. But I learned something even more valuable, that the truth, however painful, is always better than the most comfortable lie. And that lesson was worth everything it cost me to learn it.